Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the performance of number 23, Barclay Goodrow. So, of course, Goodrow was a prototypical fourth-line forward for the Sharks this season. Basically was on the fourth line for the majority of it, got a few games up on the third line, I believe, even played a couple games with Joe Thornton, but mostly was on the fourth line. His frequent line mates were, during the regular season, Carlson, Goodrow, and Carlson himself and Redill. Now, it was quite close in the regular season, as in the playoffs, it was Carlson, Goodrow, and Haley, which was also a pretty frequent line in the regular season, as the fourth line was mostly moved around a lot. Sometimes, although it was usually Carlson and Goodrow, sometimes they were with Redill, as I said, sometimes with LeBanc, sometimes with Donskoy, sometimes with Sorensen. And so there was sort of like a musical chairs for the third player on that fourth line, but Barclay Goodrow was almost always there and almost always the center on the line. Now, in the regular season, he actually managed to play all 82 games, which I'm sure for a player like Barclay Goodrow, he's extremely proud of being able to do that. He got 7 goals and 10 assists for 17 points. Not great, but also not too bad, really, for a fourth-line forward. He was a +4, which is a pretty important stat for fourth-liners, to know that you aren't more of a hindrance on a line than you are more of you aren't like a liability on a line. And while Goodrow wasn't a fantastic fourth line forward, where if you look at a team like the Blues or the Bruins, the two teams that made the Stanley Cup Finals, their fourth lines you could potentially even play up against top lines of the other team, and don't not really expect to be scored on. If you put Goodrow up against the other team's top competition, maybe you'd have some issues, but he was normally pretty good for matching up against other bottom six lines. He also, strangely enough, and this is why he's my interesting stat here, had 3 game-winning goals. So basically half of the goals he scored during the regular season were game winners. So I don't know if that's just a coincidence, as you'll see also in the playoffs, or if Barclay Goodrow is just a big time player here, but I just thought that was a pretty interesting stat. For his time on ice, he had just about 11 minutes. A good chunk of that was actually shorthanded. The Sharks' 2 main shorthanded forward units are Hertl and Couture, and then Goodrow and Carlson, and so they really had the majority of the shorthanded ice time. Goodrow at around a minute and a half, giving him just about 9.5 minutes of even strength ice time. Not really out of the ordinary for fourth liner, especially on a team like the Sharks last season, which were quite deep, being able to play 3 very strong lines. The fourth line not needed as much. In the playoffs, Goodrow played every single game as well, 20 games. However, his point total wasn't as impressive, just 2 goals, no assists to go with that for the 2 points. However, of course, those 2 goals were monumental. His -3 wasn't great. As I said, his plus-minus is a pretty decent stat for being able to tell how a fourth liner does, and Goodrow wasn't fantastic defensively in the playoffs at times, especially since in the playoffs other teams are looking to match up against your fourth line, and as I said, Goodrow maybe not the best at defending against other teams' top competition, but as I said, the 2 goals that he scored in the playoffs were actually 2 game winners, both coming in the series against Vegas. And of course, there's the lesser talked about one in game 5, which was a pretty dominant game from the Sharks, so it just so happened that Goodrow's goal was the game winner. But of course, the obviously biggest goal of the playoffs for the Sharks this past year, and in a long time really, was the game 7 goal against the Golden Knights in double OT, I believe. Oh no, it was only in single OT, but it was near the end of it. Barclay Goodrow, on basically his second shift of that overtime, got the goal going around Marc-Andre Fleury. So again, I don't know if he's a clutch player. Is this just an insane coincidence? But he scored less than 10 goals. He only scored 9 goals through 102 games this past season, and 5 of them were game winners. That's over half. And for the time on ice, 11 minutes, 43 seconds, it of course went up. What was particularly interesting about this time on ice is that Goodrow was the second highest in terms of shorthanded ice time, only a second behind Tomas Hertl. So of course, it does show that you could look at it one way, and that DeBoer relies on Goodrow. You could also look at it on the other way, that maybe Goodrow got caught out on the ice too long, taking long shifts as on the penalty killer, which isn't necessarily a great sign for a penalty killer, but still, the fact that he's only one of 2 forwards who have above 2 minutes of shorthanded ice time per game, and he's only a second behind Tomas Hertl, does show at least that DeBoer does trust him a decent amount. When it comes to the grades, it was a pretty average regular season for Goodrow, a C in the first quarter, a B- in the second quarter, a C in the third, and a C+ in the fourth. In the playoffs, as I said, he wasn't great offensively, he wasn't that fantastic defensively, but I gave him a B- just because of those 2 huge goals that he did score for the Sharks, the Game 7 one more than the Game 5 one, and so the B- was more of like a nice grade, but it doesn't really affect too much his final grade, which is why he ends up with a C+. It was a pretty decent year. He was a pretty consistent fourth line forward for the Sharks. He was pretty strong on the power play as well, but all in all, it wasn't some sort of standout season from Barclay Goodrow, and I suspect probably similar outputs besides maybe the game-winning goal part, unless he really is a clutch forward going into the next year. Class dismissed.